All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the MRSI's monthly webinar. I'm your host, Ashwini, for today's monthly MRSI webinar. Let me to the next slide. Before we begin, I would like to thank our patrons for their constant support on this initiative, without which we really wouldn't have been able to take this forward. So really thanking all of the patrons for the support. Before I go even forward, I just want to talk a little bit about our organization, that is MRSI. So to the next slide, please. Right. So the market research, our organization is called the Market Research Society of India, also known as the MRSI. MRSI is a not-for-profit association of providers and buyers of research and insights. The core purpose of MRSI is to create awareness of our industry, to establish and promote professional standards, and also to provide a platform for market research professionals, not just to engage, but also to showcase work and to collaborate. To drive engagement among the members of MRSI, MRSI hosts monthly webinars on various topics. These topics are theme-based, and the theme that we are driving at MRSI is the changing face of market research. Today's webinar is extremely interesting and very unique, and the speaker too is extremely passionate about this topic, and you'll see the level of engagement and the depth in this presentation. The topic for today is UX is dead, long live CX. To the next slide. To the next one, please. Let me introduce our speaker and the topic a little bit more in detail. In the world of UX, one leans towards how the visions of web or mobile screens are. But UX or user experience is, as we know it, is no longer just about the designing and the interfaces of all of that. The traditional human-centered approach to the design has in fact morphed into its new avatar, that is CX, what we know it as customer experience. And the way digital businesses use consumer research has transformed significantly. The process of creating customer insights for digital business has changed, and there are new expectations from these insights in terms of the information, the branding, and decision making. So the question here is, how should consumer research respond to these new needs? So there are a few key takeaways from this webinar that you would know. How UX has changed in today's world, what research needs to adapt, and how it informs the design and the brand elements, and also an introduction to how behavioral science and behavioral elements can be leveraged into the designing elements to it. I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Geetika. She heads the Center of Behavioral Research. She's a managing partner at the Future Factory. She's an MBA in marketing and an engineering degree, a strong design practice. Geetika brings an unusual confluence of business, technology design to the work at the Center for Behavioral Research at Asia's leading innovation and design firm, the Future Factory. Her work at the center is focused on design technology through user-centered design approach. Over the past 15 years, she has helped consumer and technology companies, as well as government and industry bodies across Asia, launch successful products leveraging consumer behavior. She also published articles in Europe and in ABP in India. She advises academia on business design and innovation. So without any further ado, I would like to kick things off by welcoming Geetika for this session. However, before we move forward, I just wanted to mention to all our members that today's session is being recorded, and we have kept all the speakers on mute, requesting you to pose your questions through the Q&A chat box, and we will put forth the questions towards the end of the session. So without any further ado, Geetika, all over to you.
Thanks, Ashwini. Thanks for all the kind words. I think that really sets the standards on what we should be sharing today. It's a pleasure to be here. And as you said, the topic is just fantastic. So I think we're going to have a wonderful 1 hour. I'm going to switch my video off so that we can, have an uncompromised experience on the webinar. But hello, everyone, and glad to be here. Okay, so like we said, the topic really is about UX and CX, and I think one of the things that that came to our mind when we actually selected this topic is that there's a whole bunch of jargon in the industry today. First we talked about UI, then we talked about UX, now we're talking about CX, and it's a question that's on everyone's mind. Is this just an overload of jargon? I mean, are we just complicating things with new concepts, or really is there a shift in the industry, and therefore is CX a shift in the way that we have to approach not just design but also research that informs design? And we've got 3 questions here that we're hoping to answer. One is that what really has changed? How critical is CX, and how seriously do we have to take it? And if we do have to take it seriously, then what are the challenges, and how do we adapt to these new challenges in order to be relevant in the world that awaits us? Yeah, so let's get to the first one, right? Why CX? And it's very interesting when you think about it that customer satisfaction and customer service are the typical consumer metrics that we have used in the past, right? Even loyalty, retention. I mean, anyone in brands or from research in the attendees will understand what we're talking about here. On the other hand, the word experience has always been metrics that have been related to design. So we've talked about user interface, user experience, and now CX kind of ties up both these metrics. So just taking a step back, when we first talked about user interfaces, we were talking about beautiful screens that made you feel good, screens that were also easy to understand. So we were looking at design and we were looking at cognitive theory. And then we said, you know what, it's not just about understanding a screen, because it's also about how you move to the next screen, and it's also about how you experience the entire interface as a whole, not just individual elements, which means we've got to figure out which screen comes first. We've got to figure out what I'm supposed to click on, where I'm supposed to go, and how my entire experience across the product is defined. And we therefore started calling it user experience. And then we had things like information architecture and user journey and all these other aspects that came in, and we kind of changed that definition a bit. Now, when we're talking about CX, we're saying, how do we take user experience and add all those metrics of loyalty, satisfaction, retention, CSAT, all of that back, along with great user experience design? And that's quite complicated. If you think about it, it really is quite complicated. So if you were to look at this, really, how is CX different from UX? And the point is that if you think of a customer as not just a user, that changes the entire definition of what you're supposed to do, which means that I could look at a potential customer even before he becomes a user, which means I'm looking essentially at the pre-purchase journey. Or I could look at a customer after he drops off from my user experience. Then I'm looking at, retention, maybe service, maybe some of those elements. And now this changes everything, because now we're not talking about user experience to design a great product or to develop a great product, because we're talking about a customer who hasn't even probably reached that product. So instead we're thinking, what do we do whenever the customer experiences us? And that opens up a plethora of questions for research in terms of how they can inform not just design, but inform a bunch of other divisions on how they might actually experience research. So, if let's say that really is a big shift, right? I mean, now we're saying we want to figure out how we can understand how the customer is, or how a person is actually experiencing my brand before he even opens my screen or downloads my app. Maybe he's thinking about, if I'm a bank, he's thinking about opening getting into some kind of an engagement with a brand to conduct a transaction. If I'm an entertainment consumer internet business, maybe he's thinking, I need to watch something tonight. Where should I look? What should I do? How do we reach out to all those people, and how is research actually working in those spaces? And I think one of the biggest questions we have here as a challenge is that there isn't really one person in charge. And it's a good question to say why. Now, if you go back into the 90s, don't know how many of our attendees are even that old, but really, if you do go back that long, P&G had, launched the classical definition of a brand manager, and that had changed the way the entire industry was looking at it. Anyone from the CPG industry knows what a brand manager is. He's the guy whose neck is online, right? Anything that goes wrong that affects the brand and eventually affects the business, that man is in charge. But the point is that today, the classical definition of that brand manager is no longer relevant. And the reason that's happened is because there's been this big shift into digital use. And that is pretty much a paradigm shift. And it's kind of accelerated very quickly and caught a lot of organizations off guard. Of course, in India, it's happened more recently, maybe 2016, 17. Of course, we had the smartphone penetration, and then we had, the geo coming in with the bandwidth, and it became possible to actually experience better because video sharing, etc., became possible. Whole lot of possibilities opened up, but we're not prepared to have one person in charge, and that's one of the biggest problems. The other thing that's happening is, if I'm going to figure out, as a researcher, I'm trying to track how to make a great user experience, a customer experience, even before someone's become a user, then that's the job of sales. If I'm trying to figure out how a person perceives my brand in order to, make them consider it, then that's talking to the branding division. If I'm talking about how easy it is for them to download the app, then I'm talking about design. So we're really talking to different divisions in this industry. And that's the biggest problem for us on CX today. So here's an interesting example that we might want to take. So at Future Factory, we've done a bunch of research across service companies and what we call real world companies as well, the traditional consumer product group companies. And I'm just going to dive into one of the experiences we had, which was a bit online, offline. Just assume somebody's using a map. Let's say one of us is in a car, we're getting ready to drive, and we've turned on our maps, and we find an error. And so what are you likely to do? You're likely to conceal your frustration and, shrug it off and work around it and move on. Now, that's a worst case scenario for the brand or the business, because there's no customer experience at all there. Let's say that there's a level 1 where the interface actually gives you an opportunity to express that frustration. And now that's design kicking in, right? So design says, you know what, the app is our problem. And clearly, this guy's been messing around with the system, but it hasn't responded the way it's supposed to. We know that. So we're going to throw up, a pop-up or, ask him to whether he wants to express some feedback. And the way to measure that is CSAT, which is customer satisfaction scores, which is what design's not, by the way, responsible for services. So that's a different ballgame altogether. But let's say, yes, I say, yes, actually, I am frustrated. I want to help you because I don't want this problem again. So here's my feedback. This is what you got wrong. And we put that in. Now, there's another thing that could happen. The system could say, go, great. We've taken it down. We're going to, push it to the right department to look at it. And we're going to give you a feedback message saying, thank you. That's the second level of customer satisfaction or customer experience that you can offer. You've allowed design feedback there. But then again, that's not the level at which companies are operating today. In fact, what companies do, and I mean, we work closely with them, so I know it's happening, is we take that data immediately, because it's being captured real time, feed that back into the design and say, you know what, we're going to test this. Now think about it from a research point of view. Imagine you had a live panel of people that kept popping up into your life and said, you know what, here I am. This is what I think we should try, and I'm willing to test it. So you're like, super, that's fantastic. and you make that change, which we call a prototype, and you push that prototype down to only that user who has actually made that complaint. Maybe there are a bunch of them who've done it, so there's a sample size involved. But what we're doing is essentially what we call A/B testing, and it happens real time. Now see how that works, because for the design team, it's fabulous, right? You're getting a live panel free of cost in real time to respond and give you feedback. So it's very helpful to the business. And look at how it's helping CX, because I'm looking at this, I've just reported an error, and the next time I turn on Maps, they fixed it. Now, I don't know that they fixed it only for me, but for me at least, it's fixed. And they're telling me, you know what, we fixed this. We'd love you to tell us, whether this is working for you or not. Now, I am totally converted into their brand evangelist. And that's really the third level of CX, and that's where we need to go. And we're going to come to this a little later, but essentially the biggest challenge that we need into delivering this great CX is for research to understand tech. That's the only way we can move from level 1 to level 3. Yep, let's take another example. This is a little simpler, but let's take the example, of a bank. And let's say that there's a traditional offline bank that wants to get online, and it says, for various reasons, we need to move our transactions online. And therefore, the usage part of the journey now needs to become digitally enabled. Again, level 1. This is UX, right? The bank could actually have an alternative goal. The bank might turn around and say, how do I use digital technology to make sure that that customer experience is fantastic whenever the customer thinks of us? Now, we're not talking about UX. Now we're talking about customer acquisition, right? When somebody needs to transact, how do they think of me? Because everyone has a bunch of operations. We very rarely go to our bank. It's digital wallets. It's God knows what else. It's definitely not credit cards. Unfortunately, they've lost the game, but that's again another story. But now see what we're talking here. We're saying, how do we present ourselves at the right moment, at the right opportunity? Then, how do we create the right nudge to enable the right consumer behavior for decision making? And you see that last line, it's all research language. It's all consumer inciting language. This should actually be our domain. This is the domain of research. And it's a place we're missing out. And that's the issue. We really need to get there. So I think the overall point here is that there isn't one specific ownership assigned to this, but in some sense, we're trying to integrate a whole bunch of positions around the value chain, whether it's sales, brand, design, support. And that's one of the biggest challenges that we have in what we're facing. So how are people actually doing that then? I mean, we're not going to turn our org structure upside down, right? And we've got enough on our plate, as everyone knows. So the best workaround to this is to start measuring the right metrics around these. And essentially what that means is that we have to push the right metrics across all the points of the value chain so that they talk about a customer experience in all. So let's say you have the service division that's looking, let's say, a call center, and they're responsible for CSAT. Maybe we have a bunch of divisions that are responsible for the outcome metrics of NPS. Maybe we have the brand that's responsible for consumer loyalty or consumer retention, which eventually will have to tie up to NPS at some level. So how are we as a business actually doing that? And that's the workaround that most people are working with. So what industries are doing is working with what we call a CX dashboard. And it's measured across these divisions. And it's a CFT, a cross-functional team that actually decides these metrics, ties them together, and then throws them up live, accessible to all these divisions. And that's very, very powerful because now we're talking not just about delivering an individual divisional outcome, but we're actually delivering a brand promise and going back to the brand and the business. Right. So what really are the big skills that we need? Let's say this is a big challenge, right? Things have turned upside down. People are more online than they were supposed to. So our organization structures aren't working around to support that correctly. And we are trying to work around metrics that will actually help us get this right, because we've got to be there for the customer at all points of time. And that's the user expectation. It's not just about, an internal expectation. If we don't meet it, we don't get the business. So what do we need to do? And as researchers, how do we get there? Yeah, I think this line says it all, right? I mean, we are, at the end of the day, research is about the consumer, but at the end of the day, all parts of the business are about the business. And essentially, the business or the brand has to deliver its promise. And it's a bunch of people who can actually make us do that. But across its technology, that's helping us do that best. Now, this is pretty much irreversible. I mean, it's not possible right now to go back to an age where we're not going to be digitally enabled. If at all, this is a one-way street, and it's going to get even more powerful as part of our lives. And I think one of the big skills that we need, which is what I've been leading up to, is for researchers to stop thinking about themselves only as researchers and custodians of the consumer, and start understanding that if they have to be prescriptive, they really need to understand technology. There are too many opportunities which actually should be in our domain that we're letting go because we don't see it as our problem. And this is a losing game for us. So one of the big skills that we need is really to get into digital, think of ourselves, in our company at Future Factory, we have this saying that everyone's an engineer. I mean, it doesn't matter what you've studied. At the end of the day, if you don't understand technology, you can't compete. So, everyone's an engineer. And it's a good line to take, because it gives you the comfort and confidence that this is not beyond you. But three things that we need to take forward. We have to start with consumer needs, which is why it brings us back to the fact that this is really our problem. And, CX is about user-driven design or user-driven development, wherever it occurs, in sales and service design, in product design, it doesn't matter. But it starts from the user and the understanding of what is their hero moment, or where is the point of failure, and what's stopping a frictionless journey from occurring for that particular person. And technology can do so much, right? I mean, we've all heard about how personalized journeys happen and how it's feasible to actually deliver that. So a bunch of work around that, but that's the first point. Yeah, and this is the second, which is why I think we keep talking about the brand and how CX is about the brand. The point really is that we need to be guided by emotion. And design has got that right. I mean, I work in a design company, CBR, or Center for Behavioral Research, is a center of excellence that supports that, but they do it beautifully. So if you're working as a research company that's supporting UX, you'll know that the UX guys, they get emotion. If you're working to support brand, brand gets culture. They get it perfectly. And as researchers, I think we need to get comfortable with talking the language of emotion and culture. And this kind of brings us to a point that I'm going to bring up later as well. There's a bunch of us who say, we're qualitative researchers, we understand emotion. We're ethnographers, we understand culture. Or, we're design thinkers, so, we understand, the empathy. But the point is that that is a silo we can't afford to keep. And I mean, if we, at least, at the very least, we've got to think about ourselves as researchers, not a particular kind of researcher, not a researcher that specializes in a particular kind of methodology. And emotions and culture is going to be very critical for us if we're going to deliver an experience. So it's about time that we don't leave that to somebody else's problem and expand that and say, look, this is a skill I need to know. How do you measure emotion? How do you understand, assess culture? And I might be a quant guy who's, done, I don't know, choice-based conjoint all my life, but I still need to understand this if I need to work to deliver a CX. And that's a big bunch of work that I think we need to work on. Sure, yeah. This is a very interesting point. I think the idea about providing choice is about having the opportunity to be prescriptive. You cannot offer a great experience unless you offer a customer choice. You can give them a frictionless journey, you can be very empathetic towards them, but if they can't do something with your experience that works in their favor, you've lost it. And we're seeing that shift in a bunch of places, right? I mean, if you look at healthcare, for example, there's this move from saying, I'm a healthcare practitioner, I'm a surgeon, I'm a doctor, I will tell you what to do. And that's being moved to patient empowerment, where we say, we're going to give you the right information and you are going to make the right action. And we're seeing the same move into education now, where we're saying, we're not going to teach you, we're going to enable learning, right? And that's about providing choice. And research needs to do the same thing. If we want to deliver customer experience, we need to know how to be prescriptive. We have to kind of move out from collecting data into advising on what to do with that data. And providing choice will essentially mean that we have to do that. Yeah, so I mean, all in all, of course, there are new tools to do that. Yes, there's design research, there's ethnography, there's behavioral sciences. Recently, we've been involved in something called behavioral analytics. And I think that's where we need to go, because now we're talking, literally, we're talking cognitive psychology and behavioral economics mixed up with computer science, with data science. And that it's not just about picking up a new method, it's about being comfortable with a whole new domain. And it's only when you can do that can you adapt some of your old tools for the new ones. It's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? I mean, everything we've learned so far has gotten us to a certain place. If at all, I think research is one of the domains that is based on very rigorous science, very, very rigorous, proven methodologies across whatever area we might of specialization we might decide to take. But human-centered development, whether it is design or technology or service design, is about adapting some of those tools to the new rules that govern these businesses. And for that, I think in order to adapt our old tools to the new normal, we've got to be able to embrace things like data science, technology, computer science, first of all, quantitative for those who are in qual, and emotion and culture for those who are in quant. Right. So yeah, that's broadly what we wanted to talk about. I think there are broadly three bunches of takeaways that we had. The first one is that CX is about customer experience. It's the C in it essentially means that we have the usual customer metrics, but the X in it essentially means that it has the UX part of design. And when you put them both together, you're really not talking about a user anymore. You're talking about people and who are not users yet. And CX is about finding them, keeping them, making them happy, and making sure they stick on, which essentially means you're working with brand, sales, service, support, and you're using a whole bunch of methodologies to advise these teams on how they can deliver CX in their own domain. Of course, the challenge comes from the fact that there is no one division. So, whom do we talk to in research? And you'll find that briefs come up from everywhere. If you look at our MAPS experience, we got that brief from design, but a similar brief we got from marketing. And the design team was talking about decreasing drop-offs and error rates reporting. And the business team was talking about improving NPS scores. So, we could get briefs from anywhere, but we've got to be able to connect the dots across and understand how one is affecting the other. And I guess the way to prepare for this and address this really is, of course, to find a way to make sure that we have adequately prepared for the new world by getting out of our comfort zone, by putting that silo behind us and embracing what we need to do next. Yeah, that I love this line actually. We started with it, and I'm going to end with a quote. You have to forgive me. I work in a design company, so it's a quote by Steve Jobs. I'm sorry for being as cliched as it sounds, but it's not really a quote, but it's something he said, right? He said, "My biggest inspiration is the Beatles," and he said that's because there were four guys, right? Four young boys, and each of them had their own problems, but they kind of kept each other in check. They kind of balanced out each other's negative tendencies, because at the end of the day, the whole was so much greater than even the sum of the parts. And that's where we are with CX. Where we are with CX is how do we actually get brand to talk to sales and design, and get design to talk to customer service, and how do we have one common metric that works across. The briefs come from everywhere, but how do we use user driven approaches that actually start with the customer, start with understanding what drives this experience, what makes it fail, what can make it beautiful, and push ourselves to understand technology and be prescriptive to the departments we work with on what they can do next. That's it from me. Ashwini, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Geetika. The presentation was really very insightful, and I'm really delighted with all the questions that we are getting in. Actually, the audience was very engaged, so that's the big thanks to the audience too. So let me kick this off with a few questions that have just come in. The question that's posed right here is in terms of if you could elaborate in terms of understanding the tech. So what we mean is over here, what's currently missing in the typical researcher's understanding of technology? What gap do you see?
Oh, that's a big question. Yeah, it's a bit of a challenge, right? I mean, tech is a big word, digital is a big word. So where do you start? I think the first point is to understand what business you're working with and what tech they are using. Because otherwise, you're going to be prescribing more innovation to them than what they can do with the tech that they're already employing. So, if you're working for an innovation company, sure, I would say we should do a bigger task. But let's say you're working in a qualitative research firm where you're focusing on brand and on customer needs that actually drive new features or new expectations or new consumption for that brand. It's likely that the consumer, the CPG group is doing a lot of social listening, for example. And you understand that in order to understand emotions and culture or how people are experiencing your brand in different moments of their journey, that you really need to understand how social listening works. And we were talking recently to another party in the research business, and social listening is done by a bunch of people in technology, but it's also done by research. I mean, you can sit down and identify maybe 30 forums or blogs or boards and say, I want to understand what's going on here, and use certain tools to pull that out, which are traditional qualitative research tools. But it's possible to do that, and then connect the dots to create a bigger picture. So I think the starting point on the tech is first, can we be comfortable with saying, I don't know how you're using technology to understand users outside of primary face-to-face interaction. So can you tell me how you're doing that? Right? And either the business knows it or the industry knows it. You could read up and figure out what's happening in the industry. But if you're informing marketing, then they're using social listening. If you're informing service, then that they're using call center data and they're running analytics on call center data, which means you need to understand analytics, right? So that's a great way to start by saying, who are my clients? Are they the brand, sales, service, design, support, and what is the tech that's driving their work today?
Sure. Thanks, Geetika. There's another question that's come up specifically related to academia. So what are the academic disciplines that we need to borrow from? That's one. And the second follow-up to that is also, what is the current stage, according to you, in terms of the collaboration between academia and CX research practitioners?
Okay, it's poor, to say the least. And I think there's so much we need to do there, Praveen. I understand the questions come from you. But there's really so much we need to do there, because I'll just take a step back and say I'm not even very sure whether we have good academic practice on research. I mean, we have such fabulous engineering colleges, but where are the great research universities or research programs? I mean, they're few and far between, and they haven't really been able to keep up. Do we really need to pick up MBAs and done a little bit of research and teach them the deep methodologies that we've studied? So, and I don't know how many of you have read the new education policy and everything that's happening in with the change in the way digital is overtaking the entire education practice. But it does offer the opportunity to say, forget about full-scale undergrad, postgrad programs. Let's just look at how we can train our people with the skills they need to get started. And whether those skills are, that training is delivered online or offline in short pieces or medium-term bursts or ongoing programs, irrespective of that, there are a bunch of things that we need to teach. So coming back to your first question on what are these academic programs that we could look at, I think there are basic skills we need to do. So the first thing is, unfortunately, as research today, we're still very, very uncomfortable talking about the other face. When I say the other face, if I'm in qual, I don't want to talk quant. If I'm quant, I don't understand qual. I will just refuse to do that. I think that's the first thing we have to solve. And I mean, I would say it's not just academia, but I think even practitioners in this country have to start saying, okay, you know what? Here, qual researchers, here's a crash course on quant, right? Because how are you going to understand analytics if you don't understand statistics? Now, are you devoid of those skills? No. I mean, most people in these jobs are at least 12th standard pass people. They've done a fair amount of statistics to get there, but they've never really practiced it. They've never really applied it in any which way. And that's a problem. So I think the first bit is for us to understand numbers and the soft part. How do we combine the left and the right brain? That's the first skill I think we need to get out. Then that's the only way we can understand the what we call the big data and the small data to be able to put it together. Understanding how technology works, what Mithila asked, that's a simpler thing. You can do a crash course on analytics. You can get out there and self-study on analytics. You can attend a bunch of free webinars. You can teach yourself. You will never be an analytic practitioner, but you'll definitely understand how that works enough to be able to prescribe for it. But the other stuff, I think, we need to get right. I think it's about time we looked at ourselves as understanding all methods of research enough, even though we want to be deeply qualified in some. So to answer your question, in design, we have this saying about having T-shaped people. A T-shaped person is someone who, like the top of the T, knows enough about everything to be able to relate to it and apply it. And the bottom part, that's the standing part, if you say, for the T, is they can dive into one part of it. And I think that's what we need to do. Academia needs to teach us how to be T people, but I'll go so far as to say that, as practitioners, we need to become T people.
Thanks, Geetika. We do have a few questions and we do have time at hand. So there's another question in terms of can CX or research CX design be applied for a deeper understanding of consumer shopper behavior, specifically for e-com portals?
Of course. I mean, that's the first point of application, right? I personally have been involved in several studies on that part. And that's the issue, right? E-commerce portals traditionally will take analytics and say, we know what's happening with the customer. You don't know what's happening. You know what's happening. You don't know why it's happening. There's this one interface we had recently with a very large e-commerce company that has its own digital wallet. And it said, we've got great insights. We know that 60% of our users are women. Now, hey, I'm sorry, that's not an insight. That's data. You need to convert that data into insights before you know what to do with it. Otherwise, what you're going to do is go and target more women in your SEO and your social media marketing. And that's not helping you because they're already attracted to you. So what are you doing with that data? And research needs to take that piece of information, create it into an insight and say, why are women buying this? I mean, I'll go so far as to twist it around and say, why are men not buying? right? I mean, why are 40% of your clients only men? And if you know the answer to those questions, you will prescribe a certain piece of action. You tell the e-commerce giant, you should be doing this to attract more men, or, now that you understand the user behavior that's guiding women to buy your products, or, to use your wallet, how do you use them? How you use that insight to guide the work on your other platforms? Because you know what works for women online. How do you apply that in different places? So there's a lot of consumer behavior work that is going on around behavioral sciences, around adding behavioral sciences to behavioral analytics, and kind of mapping a much deeper understanding on the why of what people are doing, rather than just focusing on the what. Sorry, does that answer your question, Vijay?
I think we'll hear from him. He'll respond to the chat on the chat. Moving to the next question, this is related to while customers are enjoying and adopting to digital, but we see that we still are leaning towards human touch and human interface. So how companies are trying to draw a balance between the two? And I just want to add to this also. What I do see is considerable amount of design elements and the website interactions and all of those things. Assume that a common individual is interacting. So for example, if I want to open a bank account, I am quite comfortable with a digital platform to do so. However, if my mother wants to open a bank account, she is not so comfortable with doing that online. So how does the interface adapt in understanding who the individual is by responding to a few clicks here and there, and then change the interface which actually resonates more with the individual, rather than just have a common page for all?
Yeah. I think you've kind of partially answered the question, if I might say, Ashwini. I think, I think the ability for technology to develop personalized experiences is tremendous. I think we're already there. There's no question on how might we adapt technology, our experiences, understand personalized experiences. We already know how. We already know that's happening. The question is, what do we do with it? And I think, like Ashwini correctly said, when we know that, because technology is allowing us to do that, and we're using the right, I might add, please, that we're using the right human-centered tools or research tools to process that information correctly, because sometimes we just get information and we don't understand it correctly in the right context. But let's say we're using research to enhance that piece of work. Now we know whether the person who has this problem is a 70-year-old woman or a 25-year-old young man. What do we do going forward? And I think the point is, I would go so far as to say the prescriptive action that comes out of this understanding should not only be online. And a bunch of reasons why, right? The kind of problem that needs to be solved, it's not about whether that problem can be solved online or not. It's a problem about whether the customer is going to feel comfortable solving it online or not. And that's why I keep saying we have to talk about the softer stuff, right? Possibilities, deliveries are different from building reassurance, creating trust, enhancing the engagement level, a lot of which sometimes need a human touch. Now, there are ways to do it through digital as well. I'll give you an example. L'Oreal has been working on a platform. I read this recently. I haven't worked with them, so disclaimers there. But they've been working on a platform where they're using bots to track people in their user journey before they come to the complaint point. Now that's fabulous, because by the time you've come and said, look, I have a complaint with this lipstick, you already know that this person has bought it from here, has an issue most likely with the mechanism of how the lipstick is opening or shutting. It's a new purchase, and this is his experience. Now imagine you use this on flying, on reclaiming lost baggage, on anything. And you could have a human respond to that personally if the criticality of that complaint is high. And you may decide that if it's not something that needs that kind of reassurance and personalized experience, we can address it through a bot. So there's a mix of physical and digital, and you need to apply that with your judgment depending on the information that this personalized journey throws up. So the possibilities here are really tremendous. I don't think we're ready to move to a pure online experience. At least at a personal level, I don't see that working. I think as humans, we need certain elements of that human touch that today we're not comfortable technology is able to provide adequately, which means we're going to continue to provide that in person. I don't know what the future holds. That's a different game.
Sure. Really, thanks a lot, Geetika. The session and your time was really helpful. I found the section very engaging and very insightful. So thank you so much. I just want to mention to all the members here on MRSI is that we are recording today's session, and post the session gets completed, we'll share the recording and the feedback survey form. So please share your feedback towards the end of the day. And also you can leverage the members login page to access the recording. But before we sign off, I just want to give a heads up about the next upcoming webinar on the next slide. The upcoming webinar is on the 21st of October, and it's extremely unique. It's all about digital advertising, and it's unique because we have two different agency partners collaborating together to talk about digital advertising. We have Shweta from Kantar, and we have Ravi from Matrix Lab. So this will be a really unique and an interesting session for everyone. So looking forward for it, and requesting all the members to sign up for the session. You will soon receive more details and link for registration. So thank you very much. And Geetika, really thank you so much for the session. And I also would like to thank the audience for the time too.
Thanks so much, Ashwini. It was a pleasure. I'm really happy to have a nice, candid chat with the community on what we're headed for. And thanks for working with me on this topic. I think it's fabulous. And thanks everyone for being such a great audience.
Thank you. Thanks.